Elena pressed her back against the wooden door and clamped a hand over her own mouth, but it was too late. The words had already left her lips, and now they hung in the cold hallway air like smoke that would not clear. Please don't let them take my baby. She had not meant to say it so loudly. She had not meant to say it at all, not where anyone could hear, not in a house where every wall seemed to have ears, and every shadow seemed to belong to someone who reported to the elders. Marta grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her away from the door, her eyes wide with fear. "Keep your voice down," Marta whispered. "If anyone hears you, it will not matter that you are frightened. It will not matter that you did not choose this. All that will matter is that you are unmarked, and you are carrying a child, and there is no law in this pack that forgives that." Elena nodded, her whole body trembling. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in Marta's small room, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could somehow hold herself together by force alone. 3 months, she said quietly. 3 months and I still do not know what I am going to do. Outside in the hallway, a tall figure stood perfectly still. He had been walking toward the east wing of the great house, his mind occupied with reports of border skirmishes and the endless demands of ruling a territory that stretched further than most men could walk in a week. He had not intended to stop. He had not intended to listen. But something in that desperate whisper had reached through the noise in his head and silenced it entirely. Damian Blackthorne was not a man who allowed himself to be distracted. As the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, he had trained himself for years to notice everything and react to nothing until he had gathered every fact he needed. But those 5 words, spoken with such raw terror, had cut through his discipline like nothing had in a very long time. He stood outside that door for only a few seconds longer, long enough to hear the muffled sound of quiet crying, and then he continued down the hallway as though nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Something had shifted inside him, and he could not explain why. He did not know the voice. He did not know the face that belonged to it. All he knew was that somewhere in his own house, under his own protection, a young woman was terrified enough to beg an empty room not to take her child away from her. And Damian Blackthorne, who had faced down rival packs and buried friends, and made decisions that decided the fate of thousands, found that this one small, broken plea would not leave him alone. That night, Elena barely slept. She lay on her side in the small room she shared with 2 other Omega women who worked in the kitchens, and she stared at the wall until the candle burned down to nothing. She thought about the night, months ago now, when everything had changed. She had been running. She could still remember the cold air burning her lungs, and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding louder than her footsteps. She had been running from a mating ceremony she had never agreed to, arranged by her own family with a pack leader twice her age, a man known throughout the territories for his cruelty toward the Omegas under his care. She had run through the forest for hours, lost and frightened, until she had collapsed at the edge of unfamiliar territory. A stranger had found her there. She still did not know his full name. He had given her water and warmth and, in a moment of shared fear and desperate comfort that neither of them had planned, something more. By morning he was gone, and she never saw him again. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she would forget him entirely once she found somewhere safe to live out her life quietly. She had not expected to carry his child. In the world Elena lived in, an unmarked pregnancy was not simply frowned upon. It was considered a stain on the bloodline of the pack, an offense against the old laws that had governed werewolf society for centuries. An Omega who became pregnant without a proper mate bond, without the blessing of the pack's leadership, could be exiled into the wilderness alone, left to survive without protection, in territory crawling with rival packs and wild predators. In the worst cases, under the harshest interpretations of the ancient code, such women had been put through what the elders called the purity trial, a ritual so old and so feared that most young wolves only knew of it through hushed stories, meant to frighten them into obedience. Elena had heard those stories her whole life. She had never imagined she would become one of them. The following morning, she rose before dawn, as she always did, to begin her duties in the kitchens. She moved slowly now, careful with every motion, terrified that a single misstep or a single moment of nausea in front of the wrong person would give her away. She wrapped a length of cloth tightly around her middle beneath her dress, hoping it would hide the small changes in her body for a little while longer. She knew it would not work forever. She knew that within a matter of weeks, there would be no more hiding. She had considered running again. She had lain awake many nights turning the idea over in her mind, imagining herself slipping away into the forest under cover of darkness, disappearing before anyone noticed she was gone. But she was not a fool. She knew what waited for a lone, pregnant Omega in the wildlands beyond the pack's borders. She had seen the bones of those who had tried and failed. Staying meant risking everything, but leaving meant almost certain death for both her and the child she had not asked for, but already loved more fiercely than she had known she was capable of. She carried a tray of bread and tea toward the great hall that morning, her hands steady despite the storm inside her chest. She kept her eyes down, as Omegas were expected to do in the presence of higher-ranking wolves, and she did not notice the pair of sharp eyes following her from across the room. Damien had not planned to be in the great hall so early. He told himself he had simply wanted to review the morning reports before the council gathered, but in truth, some part of him had wanted to walk past the kitchens, wanted to see if he could recognize a voice among the servants moving through the halls. He did not know what he expected to find. He certainly did not expect to find himself studying the careful, guarded movements of a young woman he had never noticed before, a woman who moved like someone carrying a great weight she was desperate not to drop. He did not approach her, not yet. He simply watched, the way he watched everything, cataloging small details without knowing yet what they would mean. The way she pressed a hand briefly against her stomach when she thought no one was looking. The way her eyes darted toward the door every time it opened, as if she expected danger to walk through it at any moment. The way she flinched, just slightly, when Councilman Rurik's voice boomed from the far end of the hall, discussing pack matters with two other elders. Rurik was the head elder of the Blackthorn pack, a broad, gray-haired wolf who had served under Damien's father before him, and who believed, with unshakable conviction, that the old laws existed for good reason. He had enforced the purity trial twice in his long life, and he spoke of both occasions with a grim pride that had always unsettled Damien, even as a boy. Rurik did not tolerate weakness. He did not tolerate what he called impurity in the bloodlines, and he had a way of sensing secrets long before anyone confessed them. Elena kept her head down as she passed near the elders' table, setting fresh tea before them with practiced efficiency. She did not linger. She did not make eye contact. She simply completed her task and retreated toward the kitchen as quickly as she could without drawing attention. It was only after she had gone that Damien realized he had been holding his breath. He spent the rest of that day distracted in a way he had not been in years. During a meeting about border patrols, his mind kept drifting back to the sound of her voice through the door, the desperate plea that had not been meant for him or for anyone. He found himself wondering who the father was, whether the young woman had any family to protect her, whether she had anyone at all standing between her and the elders who would happily see the old laws enforced to their fullest, cruelest extent. By evening, he had made a decision, though he could not fully explain, even to himself, why it felt so important. He summoned the head of household staff and asked, in a tone that was carefully casual, about a young kitchen worker who had seemed unwell that morning. It took less than an hour to learn her name. Elena. No family within the pack, no mate, no one to speak for her, should anyone ever come looking for reasons to doubt her. Damien sat alone in his study long after the candles in the great hall had been extinguished, turning the name over in his mind. He told himself, again and again, that this was not his concern. He was the Alpha King. He had a territory to defend, alliances to maintain, a council that watched his every decision for signs of weakness. He did not have time to involve himself in the private troubles of a kitchen servant he had never even properly met. And yet, when he closed his eyes that night, it was not the border reports or the council's demands that occupied his thoughts. It was the sound of a frightened voice begging an empty room to let her keep her child, and the image of a young woman moving carefully through a crowded hall, carrying a secret so heavy it seemed to bend her shoulders even as she tried to stand tall. He did not yet know what he intended to do, but he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he would not simply forget what he had heard outside that door. The days that followed felt to Elena like walking along the edge of a cliff in the dark, never knowing exactly how close she stood to the fall. She continued her work in the kitchens, continued binding her stomach each morning with hands that shook a little more each time, continued avoiding the gatherings and ceremonies where the sharp eyes of the elders might notice too much. Marta helped where she could, covering for her when the sickness struck without warning, making excuses when Elena needed a moment alone to steady herself. But Marta could not protect her from everything, and both women knew it. One afternoon, nearly a week after the day Damien had first learned her name, Elena was sent to deliver a set of linens to the private quarters, near the Alpha's own chambers, a task usually given to more senior staff. She thought little of it at the time, assuming it was simply an ordinary reassignment, the kind that happened often enough in a household as large as Damien's. She did not know, could not have known, that the reassignment had come from Damien himself, quietly arranged through channels designed to draw no attention. She knocked at the door of the small linen room near his study, and when no one answered, she let herself in to place the folded cloths on the shelves where they belonged. She did not notice, at first, that she was not alone. Damien stood near the window, having stepped into the room only moments before to retrieve a document he had left there earlier. He watched her for a long moment before she realized he was present, watched the careful, deliberate way she moved, even in a task as simple as stacking linens, and then he spoke, his voice low and measured, careful not to startle her. "You're new to this wing," he said. Elena spun around so quickly that she nearly dropped the linens still in her arms. She had never stood this close to the Alpha King before. She had seen him from a distance, at gatherings and ceremonies, always surrounded by council members and guards, always commanding a kind of quiet authority that seemed to fill a room before he even spoke. Up close, he was taller than she had realized, his presence somehow both overwhelming and, strangely, not unkind. "Forgive me, my lord," she said quickly, bowing her head and stepping back toward the door. "I did not know anyone was here. I will return another time." "Stay," he said, and though the word was simple, there was something in the way he said it that made her stop where she stood. "I did not mean to startle you." Elena kept her eyes lowered, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. She had no idea, standing there in that small room with her arms full of linens, that this was the same man who had stood outside Marta's door a week earlier. She had no idea that he already knew far more about her secret than she could have imagined. All she knew was that the Alpha King was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between curiosity and concern, and that whatever it meant, it terrified her more than she wanted to admit. "I should get back to my duties, my lord," she said softly. "Of course," Damien replied, and stepped aside to let her pass. But as she moved toward the door, he added one more thing, quietly, almost gently. "If you ever find yourself in need of anything, Elena, you may come to me directly." She froze for half a second, her hand on the door frame. He had used her name. She had never told him her name. She did not turn around to ask how he knew it. She simply nodded, murmured a quiet word of thanks, and slipped out into the hallway, her mind racing faster than her feet could carry her. By the time she reached the safety of the kitchens, she was breathless, though she had not run at all. That night, she told Marta everything, her voice barely above a whisper even though they were alone. "He knew my name," she said. "I never told him my name, Marta. How could he possibly know?" Marta had no answer for her, only a growing sense of unease that mirrored Elena's own. "Perhaps someone told him," she offered, though she did not sound convinced by her own words. "Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps the Alpha King simply knows the names of everyone under his roof." Neither of them believed it, not really. But there was little else to do except continue on as they had before, hoping that whatever attention Elena had drawn from the Alpha King would fade as quickly as it had appeared. It did not fade. If anything, it grew. Over the following days, Elena began to notice small changes she could not quite explain. Her duties shifted, again and again, always in ways that kept her further from the busiest, most crowded parts of the house, and closer to quieter corners, where fewer eyes could watch her. When she felt the sickness rise in her throat during the early morning hours, there always seemed to be, by strange coincidence, no one nearby to witness it. When Councilman Rurik once stopped her in a hallway to ask sharp, probing questions about her health, questions that made her blood run cold, Damien appeared moments later, with some minor matter requiring the elder's immediate attention, drawing Rurik away before he could press further. Elena did not understand what was happening. She only knew that somehow, impossibly, she seemed to be under a kind of protection she had not asked for and did not fully trust. She lay awake at night, turning the same question over and over in her mind, unable to find an answer that made any sense to her. Why would the Alpha King, a man with an entire territory to govern, and a council constantly testing the limits of his authority, care at all about what happened to a kitchen servant with no name worth remembering and no family worth protecting? She did not yet know that Damien had heard her voice through a closed door, begging for the safety of a child he had never seen. She did not know that her fear, spoken aloud in a moment of desperation, had reached someone with the power to change everything about her fate. All she knew was that something had shifted, something she could not name, and that whatever it was, it frightened her almost as much as the secret she was still so desperately trying to hide. She had no way of knowing that the greatest danger to her secret was not the Alpha King who had overheard her that day. It was the Elder who had already begun to suspect that something was wrong, and who would not rest until he uncovered exactly what it was. Rurik had lived a long life, long enough to see 3 Alpha Kings rise and rule the Blackthorn territory, and in all those years, he had learned to trust one thing above all else: his own instincts. Something about the young kitchen servant named Elena had caught his attention, though he could not have said exactly what it was at first. Perhaps it was the way she avoided the gatherings where all unmated Omegas were expected to appear. Perhaps it was the pale, careful way she moved, as though every step required more thought than it should. Whatever it was, Rurik had begun to watch her, quietly, patiently, the way he watched everything that troubled him. He said nothing to Damien at first. The Alpha King had many responsibilities, and Rurik did not wish to raise concerns over something that might, in the end, be nothing at all. But as the days passed and his suspicions did not fade, he began asking careful questions among the household staff, questions phrased casually enough that no one would think much of them. How long had Elena worked in the kitchens? Whether she had family within the pack, whether anyone had noticed changes in her appetite, her energy, her health. The answers he received only deepened his unease. Meanwhile, Elena's days had settled into an uneasy rhythm. She woke before dawn, bound her stomach with careful, practiced hands, and moved through her duties with a caution that had become second nature to her. She still did not understand why her tasks kept shifting toward quieter corners of the house, why she seemed to encounter Damien more often than pure chance should allow, always in moments when she needed a distraction most. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself that the Alpha King of an entire territory could not possibly be paying this much attention to a servant like her. But some quiet part of her had begun, despite every warning instinct telling her otherwise, to feel something close to safety whenever he was near. She saw him again, nearly 2 weeks after their encounter in the linen room, this time in the gardens behind the great house, where she had gone during a rare, quiet moment, to breathe air that did not smell of wood smoke and boiling stew. She had not expected anyone else to be there. She certainly had not expected to find Damien standing near the old stone fountain at the garden center, his expression distant, as though his thoughts had carried him somewhere far from the territory he ruled. She turned to leave before he noticed her, but it was too late. "You don't have to go," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet garden. "There's room enough here for both of us." Elena hesitated, torn between the instinct to obey and the instinct to flee. In the end, obedience won, as it always did. She stepped further into the garden, keeping a respectful distance, her eyes fixed on the flowers rather than on him. "I did not mean to intrude, my lord," she said. "You're not intruding," Damien replied. He studied her for a long moment before he spoke again, choosing his next words with unusual care. "You've seemed tired lately. I hope your duties are not too demanding." It was such a simple question, the kind of thing any considerate leader might ask a servant under his care. But something in the careful way he watched her face as he asked it made Elena's chest tighten with fear. She forced a small smile, the kind she had practiced so many times over the past weeks that it came almost naturally now. "I am well, my lord," she said. "Thank you for your concern." Damien did not push further, though everything in him wanted to. He could see the exhaustion behind her carefully arranged smile, could see the way her hand drifted, briefly and unconsciously, toward her stomach, before she caught herself and let it fall back to her side. He had suspected, from the moment he first saw her in the great hall, that his instincts about her condition were correct. This small, unguarded gesture only confirmed it. He wanted, more than almost anything, to tell her that he knew. He wanted to tell her that she did not have to keep pretending, not with him. But he understood, with the same careful reasoning that had guided him through years of difficult decisions, that trust could not be forced. If he revealed what he knew too soon, before she had any reason to believe he meant her no harm, he risked frightening her into doing something desperate. He had heard enough stories of terrified young women fleeing into dangerous wilderness, rather than facing the judgment of their pack, to know that fear could drive people toward choices that made their situations far worse, not better. So he said nothing more that day, only offered her a small nod and allowed her to return to her duties, watching her retreating figure with a growing sense that time was working against them both. That evening, Rurik requested a private audience with the Alpha King, a request Damien could not refuse, without raising exactly the kind of suspicion he was trying so carefully to avoid. He sat across from the old elder in his study, keeping his expression carefully neutral, as Rurik began to speak. "There is a matter I feel obligated to bring to your attention," Rurik said, his voice grave in the way it always became when he spoke of pack law. "One of the kitchen staff, a young Omega named Elena, has been behaving strangely for some weeks now. I have reason to suspect she may be concealing an unmarked pregnancy." Damien kept his face still, though his heart had begun to pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear for himself. "And what evidence do you have to support such a serious accusation?" he asked, his tone carefully measured. Rurik listed his observations, each one small on its own, but troubling when gathered together. Her avoidance of gatherings, her careful, guarded movements, the reports from other staff of illness in the early mornings, quickly hidden or explained away. "It is not proof," Rurik admitted, "but it is enough to warrant an investigation. If she is indeed carrying an unmarked child, you know as well as I do what our laws require." Damien felt something cold settle in his chest at those words. He had grown up hearing about the purity trial, had watched, as a much younger man, the aftermath of its cruelty carried out under his own father's rule. He had sworn to himself, long before he ever became Alpha King, that he would find a way to change such laws, once the authority was his to change them. He had simply never expected to be facing that promise so soon, and never for reasons quite this personal. "I will look into the matter myself," Damien said finally, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that discouraged further argument. "I would ask that you take no action until I have done so." Rurik studied him for a long moment, his old eyes sharp and searching, as though he sensed there was more to the Alpha King's response than simple procedural caution. But he was a wolf who understood the chain of command even when he disagreed with it, and he inclined his head in a shallow bow of acknowledgement. "As you wish, my lord," he said, "but I would advise you not to wait too long. These matters have a way of growing more difficult to control the longer they are allowed to continue unaddressed." After Rurik left, Damien sat alone in his study for a long time, staring into the low flames of the fireplace without truly seeing them. He understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that the quiet protection he had been offering Elena was no longer enough. Rurik's suspicions had already taken root, and old elders like him did not easily let go of a suspicion once it had formed. If Damien did nothing more, it would only be a matter of time before Rurik gathered enough evidence, or grew impatient enough, to bring the matter before the full council. And if that happened, there would be very little Damien could do to protect her, not without revealing far more than he had ever intended to reveal, about how much he already knew, and how much he had already begun to care. He thought of her standing in the garden that afternoon, the careful smile she had offered him even as exhaustion and fear clearly weighed on every part of her. He thought of the desperate plea he had overheard weeks earlier, the raw terror in her voice, as she begged an empty room for mercy that no law in his territory currently offered her. He made a decision that night, sitting alone by the dying fire, that he would not allow the old laws to take her child from her. He did not yet know exactly how he would prevent it, only that he would find a way, whatever the cost to himself, or to the fragile stability of his rule. The next morning, Elena woke to find a folded note slipped beneath the door of the room she shared with the other kitchen staff. Marta found it first, picking it up with trembling hands before Elena had even fully opened her eyes. "There's no name on it," Marta whispered, turning the note over. "But look at the seal." Elena sat up quickly, her heart already racing before she had even read a single word. Pressed into the wax that sealed the folded paper was the mark of House Blackthorn, the same symbol that appeared on every official document issued by the Alpha King himself. With shaking hands, she broke the seal and unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the brief, carefully written message inside. Meet me in the East Garden after your evening duties are finished. Come alone. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you privately, and I promise you have nothing to fear from me. There was no signature, but neither of them needed one. They both knew exactly who had sent it. Elena stared at the note for a long time after reading it, her mind spinning through every possible reason the Alpha King might wish to speak with her alone. Perhaps he had simply grown suspicious, like Rurik clearly had. Perhaps this was the moment everything she had feared for months would finally come crashing down around her. Or perhaps some small and fragile part of her dared to hope. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Marta gripped her hand tightly, her expression torn between fear and cautious encouragement. Whatever happens, she said quietly, you are not facing this alone. You have never been alone in this, not since the day you told me. Elena nodded, though the comfort of Marta's words did little to steady the storm building inside her chest. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, knowing that whatever waited for her in the East Garden that evening would change everything, one way or another. She could not have imagined, as she moved through her duties that day, with trembling hands and a racing heart, just how right she was. The East Garden looked different in the fading light of evening, shadows stretching long across the neatly trimmed hedges, the last colors of sunset bleeding orange and purple across the sky above the stone walls. Elena arrived early, unable to sit still in the kitchens a moment longer. Her nerves stretched so tight she felt as though the smallest sound might shatter her completely. She stood near the old fountain where she had spoken with Damien weeks before, wrapping her arms around herself against a chill that came more from fear than from the evening air. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the steady, measured pace she had come to recognize, even in the short time she had known of his presence in her life. He walked into the garden alone, without guards or attendants, dressed more simply than she had ever seen him, in a dark coat that made him look less like a king and more like an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary weight. Thank you for coming, he said, stopping a respectful distance away from her. Elena bowed her head, unable to meet his eyes. Of course, my lord. Your note said you had a matter to discuss. Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her carefully in the dim evening light. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his mind since the previous night, trying to find the right words, the right approach that would not send her running in fear before he could explain himself. Now that the moment had arrived, every carefully planned sentence seemed to abandon him. I owe you an honesty I have not yet given you, he said finally. Weeks ago, I was walking past a door in the servants' quarters, and I heard something I was not meant to hear. A voice, frightened and desperate, begging that no one take her child away. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, still wrapped around herself, began to shake more violently than before. She wanted to speak, wanted to deny it, wanted to run from the garden and never look back, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, and her voice had abandoned her entirely. I did not know, at the time, who that voice belonged to, Damien continued, his tone gentle but steady. It took me some time to learn your name, and longer still to understand what I could do, if anything, to help you. I want you to know, Elena, that from the moment I heard those words, I have had no intention of allowing any harm to come to you or to your child. Tears had begun to fall down Elena's cheeks before she even realized she was crying. Months of fear, of careful hiding, of sleepless nights spent imagining every terrible outcome, all of it seemed to break loose at once, and she found herself unable to hold back the sobs that shook her shoulders. Please, my lord, she managed to say between broken breaths. Please, I know what the law says. I know what is supposed to happen to someone like me. I only ask that whatever you decide, you let me go quietly, without the trial. I could not survive that. I would rather run into the wilderness and take my chances there than face what the elders would do to me. Damien crossed the distance between them before he had fully decided to move, and though he stopped himself from reaching out to touch her, understanding that she needed space more than comfort in this moment, his voice carried an intensity that made her look up at him for the first time since he had begun speaking. No one is taking you anywhere, he said firmly. Not the elders, not Rurik, not anyone in this territory, so long as I have breath in my body and authority in my hands. I did not bring you here tonight to condemn you, Elena. I brought you here because I need you to understand that you are not facing this alone anymore, and because I need your help to find a way through this that protects both you and your child without tearing this pack apart in the process. Elena stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some cruel test designed to expose her before delivering the punishment she had feared for months. But she found nothing there except quiet, unwavering sincerity, and something else, something warmer, that she did not yet have a name for, and was too frightened to examine closely. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you do this? Why would you risk anything for someone like me? I am no one, my lord. I have no family here, no standing, nothing to offer you in return. Damien was quiet for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had softened into something almost vulnerable, a tone Elena suspected very few people in his life had ever heard from him. Because I have spent years watching this pack enforce laws that I have never believed in, he said. Because I have watched good people suffer under traditions that serve no purpose except cruelty disguised as order. And because, if I am honest with myself, something about you, about the fear I heard in your voice that day, would not let me walk away and pretend I had heard nothing. They stood together in the quiet garden, as the last light of evening faded into deep blue dusk, neither of them quite ready to break the fragile understanding that had begun to form between them. Elena wiped the tears from her cheeks and, for the first time in months, allowed herself to breathe a little easier, though the danger surrounding her had not disappeared, not truly. Rurik still suspected her. The old laws still stood, unchanged and unforgiving. And somewhere out in the world, unknown to either of them, forces were already moving that would soon test everything Damien had just promised her. Tell me about the child's father, Damien said gently, after a long silence had passed between them. If we are to protect you, I need to understand everything, even the parts that are difficult to speak of. Elena hesitated, old fear rising in her throat at the memory of that desperate night months ago, running through the forest with nothing but terror driving her forward. She told him, haltingly at first and then with growing steadiness, about the arranged mating she had fled, about the stranger who had found her exhausted and freezing at the edge of unfamiliar territory, about the single night of comfort that had changed the course of her entire life. She did not know his full name. She did not know what pack he belonged to, or whether he was even still alive. She only knew that he had been kind to her, in a moment when she desperately needed kindness, and that she had never seen him again. Damien listened without interruption, his expression carefully neutral even as something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning the story over in his mind, searching for details that might matter later, though he said nothing of his suspicions to her that night. We will find a way to protect you, he said finally. But I need you to trust me, Elena, even when the path ahead does not make sense to you. Rurik already suspects something is wrong. He will not simply forget his suspicions, because a few weeks pass without incident. We will need to act carefully, and we will need to act soon. Elena nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her chest, alongside the fragile hope that had begun to take root there. What do you intend to do? She asked quietly. Damien looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, grew more determined, as though he had finally settled on a decision he had been wrestling with since the moment he first heard her voice, through that closed door weeks ago. I intend to make certain that no one in this pack, not Rurik, not the council, not anyone, has the power to take your child from you, he said, even if it means changing everything about how this territory has been governed for generations. The weight of his words hung in the quiet garden air between them, and Elena felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. She did not yet understand what he truly intended, what sacrifices such a promise might demand of both of them in the difficult days ahead. She only knew that for the first time since she had discovered she was carrying a child, she did not feel entirely alone in facing whatever came next. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadowed edge of the garden wall, a lone guard loyal to Rurik who had followed Damien at the old elder's quiet request, curious about the Alpha King's unusual behavior in recent weeks. The guard slipped away before either Damien or Elena could sense his presence, hurrying back toward the elder's quarters with news that would soon set in motion events neither of them could yet foresee. Rurik received the guard's report before the sun had fully risen the next morning, listening with a stillness that gave away nothing of the anger building beneath his composed exterior. The Alpha King, meeting privately and alone with a kitchen servant in the East Garden after dark, speaking to her with an intimacy that no proper relationship between a ruler and his staff should ever contain. Rurik had suspected for weeks that something was wrong with the girl. Now he suspected something far more troubling, that the Alpha King himself might be complicit in hiding whatever secret she carried. He said nothing to Damien directly, not yet. Instead, he began moving more carefully, more deliberately, gathering allies among the other elders who shared his conviction that the old laws existed for good reason and should never be set aside, not even by the Alpha King himself. He spoke to them quietly, in private meetings held away from Damien's watchful awareness, planting seeds of doubt about their young leader's judgment, suggesting that perhaps the pack's traditions needed defenders willing to act, even when the Alpha King himself seemed unwilling to enforce them. Damien, unaware of the extent of Rurik's growing opposition, had begun working just as carefully on his own plans. He understood that simply protecting Elena through quiet favors and careful scheduling would not be enough, not once Rurik's suspicions hardened into something more concrete. He needed a solution that would withstand scrutiny, one that could not easily be challenged even by an elder as respected and stubborn as Rurik. He spent long hours in his study poring over the old texts that recorded the founding laws of the Blackthorn Pack, searching for any precedent, any loophole, any forgotten clause that might offer Elena a path to safety that did not require him to openly defy centuries of tradition. It was slow, frustrating work, made more difficult by his need for absolute discretion. He could not risk anyone learning what he searched for, or why. Elena, meanwhile, continued her duties in the kitchens, though the weeks that followed her conversation in the garden felt different from everything that had come before. She no longer felt entirely alone in carrying her secret, and that small shift made an enormous difference in how she moved through each day. She still bound her stomach each morning, still avoided crowded gatherings where too many eyes might notice too much, but she no longer felt as though she were fighting an impossible battle entirely by herself. She and Damien met occasionally in the following weeks, always carefully, always with reasonable explanations available, should anyone question the encounters. Sometimes it was in the garden after her duties ended. Sometimes it was in the quiet library, where few members of the household ever ventured. Each time, they spoke a little longer, a little more freely, and Elena found herself, almost against her own will, beginning to trust him, in a way she had not trusted anyone since fleeing her own family months earlier. "Tell me about your life before you came here," Damien asked her one evening, as they sat on opposite ends of a long wooden bench in the library, a single candle burning low on the table between them. Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "There is not much to tell," she said finally. "I grew up in a small pack far to the south, one that valued tradition above almost everything else. My parents arranged my mating before I had any say in the matter, to a pack leader known throughout the region for his temper and his cruelty toward the Omegas in his care. I ran the night before the ceremony was meant to take place. I have not seen my family since." Damien's jaw tightened at the mention of the arranged mating, and something protective flared behind his eyes that Elena did not fully understand yet. "Do you regret leaving?" he asked quietly. "Never," she said, without hesitation. "I would rather face every danger this world could offer than have stayed and become what they wanted me to become." Damien studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening into quiet admiration. "You are stronger than you give yourself credit for, Elena," he said. "I have watched you carry this secret for months now, alone and afraid, and still you have found ways to protect yourself and your child at every turn. That is not weakness. That is courage. Most wolves twice your age could never manage." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at his words, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the way he looked at her when he spoke, as though he truly saw her, not as a servant or a problem to be solved, but as a person worth admiring in her own right. She had not realized, until that moment, how much she had craved being seen that way by anyone. "I have been searching the old records," Damien said after a comfortable silence had settled between them. "There may be a path forward that does not require open defiance of the council, though it will not be simple, and it will require both of us to be very careful in how we proceed." "What have you found?" Elena asked, leaning forward slightly with cautious hope. "There is an old provision, rarely invoked in recent generations, that allows an alpha to claim any unmated omega within his territory as his own chosen mate," regardless of her rank or standing, Damien explained. If I were to claim you formally, before the full council, your child would be recognized as legitimate under pack law, born of a proper mate bond rather than an unmarked union. The purity trial would no longer apply to you, because there would be nothing impure left to judge. Elena stared at him, understanding slowly dawning across her features, followed almost immediately by a wave of conflicting emotions she struggled to sort through. You would claim me, she repeated slowly, publicly, as your mate. It is the only path I have found that offers you complete protection under our laws, Damien said carefully. I would not ask this of you lightly, Elena, and I understand it is an enormous decision, one that would change the entire course of your life in ways neither of us can fully predict. I do not expect an answer tonight. I only wanted you to know that this option exists, should you choose to consider it. Elena sat in stunned silence for a long moment, her mind racing through every implication of what he had just proposed. To be claimed by the Alpha King himself would mean protection beyond anything she could have imagined for herself and her child. It would also mean an entirely new life, one filled with scrutiny and expectation, and the constant watchful eyes of a council that already, in the case of Rurik at least, seemed inclined to doubt and distrust her. And it would mean binding herself, in the eyes of the pack and its laws, to a man she had known for only a matter of weeks, a man whose kindness toward her she still did not fully understand, even as some fragile, hopeful part of her heart had already begun to wonder if it might grow into something more than simple protection over time. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Take all the time you need, Damien said gently. I will not pressure you into a decision that should be entirely your own. But Elena, I need you to understand something else as well. Whatever you decide, whether you accept this path or find another one entirely, I will not abandon you or your child to the mercy of the old laws. That promise does not depend on your answer. Elena left the library that evening, with her mind spinning, torn between gratitude for the safety Damien's proposal offered, and fear of everything such a bond would demand of her going forward. She thought of Marta, waiting anxiously for news in their shared room, and she knew she would need her friend's counsel more than ever in the difficult days ahead. But even as uncertainty churned within her, one truth had settled quietly and firmly in her heart. A truth she was not yet ready to speak aloud to anyone, not even to herself. Whatever the risks, whatever the unknown challenges that lay ahead, she no longer wished to face any of it without Damien standing beside her. Unbeknownst to either of them, that same evening, Rurik had gathered 3 other elders in a private chamber deep within his own quarters, laying out his suspicions and his evidence with the careful precision of a wolf who had spent decades building cases against those who threatened the order he had sworn to protect. He spoke of the meetings in the garden, of the strange favor shown toward a low-born kitchen servant, of a pattern that, taken together, suggested something far more serious than simple kindness from their Alpha King. If my suspicions are correct, Rurik told the gathered elders, his voice low and grave, then our Alpha is not only aware of an unmarked pregnancy within our own household, he may be actively concealing it. Such an act, if proven, would be a grave violation of everything our laws stand for, regardless of who commits it. The other elders exchanged uneasy glances, understanding the weight of what Rurik was suggesting. To accuse an Alpha King of violating pack law was no small matter, one that could tear the territory apart if handled carelessly, or strengthen Rurik's own position immeasurably if his suspicions proved correct and he was seen as the defender of tradition against a ruler who had strayed too far from his duties. We will need proof, one of the elders said cautiously, before we move against him directly. Rurik nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction settling over his weathered features. Then we will get proof, he said, however long it takes. 3 days passed before Elena found the courage to seek Damien out again. 3 days spent in quiet conversation with Marta, weighing every possible outcome of the choice laid before her. Marta, ever practical despite her own fear, had encouraged her gently, but firmly toward acceptance. You have spent months carrying this burden entirely alone, Marta told her one night as they lay awake in the darkness of their shared room. Now a man with the power to protect you and your child is offering exactly that, and asking nothing in return except that you allow him to help. I understand your fear, Elena, truly I do. But I also understand what will happen if you refuse, and Rurik's suspicions eventually prove correct. There will be no protection for you then, no matter how carefully you have hidden. Elena knew her friend spoke the truth, even as uncertainty continued to gnaw at her. It was not fear of Damien himself that held her back, not anymore. It was fear of what such a bond might mean for her own sense of who she was, fear of losing whatever independence she had managed to carve out for herself since fleeing her family months ago. She had run from one arranged future already. The thought of stepping into another bond, even one built on protection rather than cruelty, filled her with a complicated tangle of emotions she struggled to untangle. And yet, beneath all of that fear, there was something else, something she found harder to name. In the weeks since their first conversation in the garden, she had come to look forward to the quiet moments she shared with Damien more than she cared to admit, even to Marta. He listened when she spoke, really listened, in a way that made her feel like her words carried weight and meaning. He had never once made her feel small or ashamed of her circumstances, despite everything the world around her insisted she should feel. She found him in his study on the third evening, working through a stack of papers by candlelight, his expression tired in a way she had not seen before. He looked up when she entered, setting his work aside immediately, giving her his full attention in a manner that still, after weeks of growing familiarity, managed to surprise her. "I have thought about what you offered," she said, standing just inside the doorway, her hands twisted together in front of her. "I have thought of little else, if I am honest." Damien rose from his chair and crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, giving her space to speak without pressure. "And what have you decided?" he asked gently. Elena took a steadying breath. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, not exactly, but of what this means, of stepping into a bond that will change everything about my life, when I have only just begun to feel like I have any control over my own future at all." "I understand that fear better than you might think," Damien said quietly. "I would not ask this of you if I saw any other way to protect you and your child. But I want you to know, Elena, that whatever bond we form before the council, it does not have to define everything else between us. You will still be yourself. You will still have a voice in this household, a voice I intend to make certain is heard and respected, regardless of what our laws formally require of a mate bond." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity, and finding none. "And if I say yes," she asked slowly, "what happens next?" "We present our bond before the full council," Damien explained. "It will not be simple. Rurik will almost certainly object, and others may follow his lead, questioning the timing, questioning my judgment, questioning everything about this decision. But once the claim is formally recognized, no law in this territory will have any power to touch you or your child. You would be protected, fully and permanently, regardless of anything Rurik or anyone else might later discover or suspect." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the last of her courage. When she opened them again, something had settled in her expression, a quiet resolve that Damien recognized immediately, having seen similar resolve in his own reflection many times before difficult decisions. "Then yes," she said softly, "I accept." Something shifted in Damien's expression at her answer, relief mixed with something warmer, something he did not yet have words for, but felt deeply nonetheless. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise you, Elena, I will do everything in my power to make certain you never regret this choice." They spent the following days preparing carefully for what would come next, discussing how best to present their bond to the council in a way that would minimize the ammunition Rurik and his allies could use against them. Damien insisted on handling most of the political maneuvering himself, though he made certain to keep Elena informed of every decision, every strategy, refusing to treat her as merely a problem to be managed, rather than a partner in navigating the difficult path ahead. It was during these preparations that Elena began to notice something else changing within herself, something she had not expected when she first agreed to this arrangement. The quiet conversations she shared with Damien, meant originally only to coordinate their public presentation before the council, had begun to stretch longer than strictly necessary, lingering into discussions of nothing important at all, simple observations about the world, shared laughter over small moments of levity that neither of them had expected to find in the midst of such serious circumstances. She found herself, more than once, looking forward to these moments, with an eagerness that surprised her, and she began to wonder, cautiously, and with no small amount of confusion, whether what had begun as a practical arrangement for survival might be growing into something she had never expected to feel again after everything that had happened to bring her to this point in her life. Damien, for his part, found himself equally unsettled by the depth of his own growing feelings. He had entered into this plan with the singular intention of protecting an innocent woman and her unborn child from the cruelty of outdated laws he had long opposed. He had not expected, in the process, to find himself drawn to her quiet strength, her sharp intelligence, the gentle humor that occasionally broke through her careful guardedness when she felt safe enough to let it show. He told himself, more than once, that he needed to remain focused on the practical matters at hand, that there would be time enough later to examine whatever complicated feelings had begun to take root in his heart. But even as he told himself this, he found it more and more difficult to look at Elena and see only a problem requiring a political solution. He saw, instead, a woman he had come to genuinely admire, and whose safety and happiness had somehow become as important to him as the stability of the territory he had sworn his life to protect. Neither of them spoke openly of these growing feelings. Not yet, both too consumed by the immediate danger surrounding them, and too uncertain of how the other might receive such an admission. But the quiet warmth building between them was noticed by others in the household, even as they tried to keep their private moments discreet, and word of the Alpha King's unusual attentiveness toward the kitchen servant continued to spread through quiet whispers among the staff, whispers that eventually, inevitably, reached the ears of Rurik and his allies. The old elder listened to these reports with grim satisfaction, seeing in them further confirmation of everything he had already begun to suspect. He continued his own quiet investigation, gathering testimony from staff members who had noticed Elena's careful avoidance of gatherings, her occasional illness in the early mornings, the subtle changes in her appearance that, taken together, painted an increasingly clear picture for anyone willing to look closely enough. By the time Damien and Elena had finalized their plans to present their bond before the council, Rurik had already gathered enough circumstantial evidence to feel confident in his suspicions, though he still lacked the kind of undeniable proof that would allow him to challenge the Alpha King directly, without risking his own credibility should he prove mistaken. He would not have to wait much longer for that proof. Fate, it seemed, had other plans for how quickly the truth would come to light, plans that would test both Damien's authority and Elena's courage far sooner than either of them had prepared themselves for. The proof Rurik had been searching for arrived in a way none of them could have anticipated, delivered not through careful investigation, but through simple, unfortunate chance. Elena had been carrying a basket of laundry down a narrow staircase early one morning, when a sudden wave of dizziness overtook her, a common enough occurrence in recent weeks, but one she had always managed to hide before anyone noticed. This time, her foot missed the step entirely, and she stumbled hard against the stone wall, the basket falling from her hands and scattering linens across the landing below. The sound brought two servants running from the kitchen, and though Elena recovered quickly, waving off their concern with practiced reassurance, one of the women who arrived first, a young Omega named Grace who had never particularly liked Elena, and had long harbored quiet resentment over what she perceived as special treatment from the household staff, noticed something in that unguarded moment that Elena's careful binding could not fully hide. The curve of her stomach, visible for just a moment as her dress shifted during the fall, told a story that needed no further investigation. Grace said nothing directly to Elena, offering only cool assistance in gathering the scattered laundry before returning to her own duties. But by that same afternoon, word of what she had witnessed had found its way, through careful and deliberate channels, to Rurik himself. The old elder wasted no time. Within hours, he had gathered his allies among the council and requested an emergency session, citing evidence of a grave violation of pack law that required immediate attention. Damien received word of the session only shortly before it was set to begin, leaving him little time to prepare and even less time to warn Elena of what was coming. He found her in the kitchens, her face still pale from the morning's fall, and pulled her aside into a quiet corner where they would not be overheard. Rurik has called an emergency council session, he told her, his voice low and urgent. Someone saw enough this morning to confirm his suspicions. He intends to bring formal accusations before the full council within the hour. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Months of careful hiding, unraveling in a single terrifying moment. "What do we do?" she whispered, her hands beginning to shake. We proceed with our plan, Damien said firmly, though even he could hear the strain in his own voice. It will simply happen sooner, and under far more difficult circumstances than we had hoped. I will claim you before the council today, Elena, before Rurik has the chance to bring his accusations to a vote. Once the claim is made and witnessed, his evidence becomes irrelevant. There will be nothing left for him to accuse you of. Elena nodded, though fear still gripped her tightly. And if the council does not accept the claim, she asked, if they see through it as nothing more than a desperate maneuver to protect me from punishment? Then we will face that challenge when it comes, Damien said, taking her hands in his own, a gesture more intimate than anything he had allowed himself before this moment. But Elena, I need you to trust me now more than you ever have. Whatever happens in that council chamber today, I will not let them take your child from you. That much I promise you absolutely. They walked together toward the great hall where the council convened, Elena's heart pounding so hard she felt certain everyone around her must be able to hear it. Word of the emergency session had already spread through the household, and curious eyes followed them as they moved through the corridors, whispered speculation trailing in their wake. The council chamber was already filling with elders and senior pack members by the time they arrived, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Rurik stood near the front of the chamber, his expression grim and resolute, and when his eyes fell on Elena walking beside the Alpha King, something like triumph flickered briefly across his weathered features, quickly suppressed beneath his customary composure. Damien led Elena to a position near the front of the chamber before taking his place at the head of the assembly, his bearing radiating the calm authority of a leader who intended to control exactly how this confrontation unfolded, regardless of what Rurik had planned. My lord, Rurik began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. I have brought grave accusations before this council today, accusations concerning a serious violation of our most sacred laws. Evidence has come to my attention suggesting that the young woman standing beside you, a kitchen servant named Elena, is carrying an unmarked pregnancy, conceived outside the bounds of any recognized mate bond. Murmurs rippled through the gathered council members, though none seemed entirely surprised, suggesting that rumors had already reached most of them well before this formal accusation. Rurik continued, laying out his evidence with methodical precision, the pattern of avoidance, the reports of illness, and finally, the unmistakable confirmation from that morning's incident on the staircase. If these accusations prove true, Rurik concluded, his voice hardening with conviction, then our laws are clear on the matter that must follow. The purity trial exists precisely for circumstances such as this, to protect the integrity of our bloodlines and the sanctity of our traditions. Silence fell over the chamber as Rurik finished speaking, every eye turning toward Damien, waiting to see how their Alpha King would respond to such a serious accusation made against a member of his own household staff. Damien let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing the weight of Rurik's words to settle fully before he spoke, his voice calm and unwavering despite the enormity of what he was about to declare. Councilman Rurik's evidence, while thorough, is built upon an incomplete understanding of the circumstances he describes, Damien said, his gaze sweeping across the assembled council with quiet confidence. It is true that Elena is expecting a child. What Rurik does not know, because I have not yet made it public, is that this child is not unmarked at all. Elena is not simply a kitchen servant within this household. She is my chosen mate. The chamber erupted into astonished murmurs, gasps of shock rippling through the assembled elders and pack members. Rurik's composed expression cracked for the first time, genuine surprise and immediate suspicion flashing across his features in equal measure. This is a convenient claim, my lord, Rurik said sharply, once the murmurs had quieted enough for his voice to carry. Made only after evidence of her condition became impossible to hide any longer. Forgive me if I question the timing. I understand your skepticism, Damien replied, his tone remaining steady despite the challenge. But the timing of this announcement does not change its truth. I have chosen Elena as my mate, and I claim her and the child she carries as my own, under the full authority granted to me as Alpha King of this territory. If the council wishes to challenge that claim, I will answer any questions you have. But I will not stand by and allow ancient traditions, however deeply respected, to be used as a weapon against a woman under my protection and the child we will raise together. The chamber fell into tense silence once more, the weight of Damien's declaration settling over the assembled council like a physical presence. Elena stood beside him, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to appear composed, acutely aware that the next words spoken in this chamber would determine not only her own fate, but the future course of the entire territory's laws and traditions. Rurik studied Damien for a long, tense moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of challenge that promised this confrontation was far from over. "Very well, my lord," he said slowly. "If this claim is genuine, then let it be formally recognized before this council, as our laws require. But know this, I will be watching closely to ensure every proper step of the claiming ritual is observed, without exception. Our traditions demand nothing less, even from our Alpha King." Damien met the old elder's gaze steadily, understanding perfectly well that Rurik's words carried a warning far beyond simple procedural concern. "Then let us proceed properly," Damien replied, "and let this council witness a claim made with complete sincerity and full commitment." As the council began the formal preparations for what would come next, Elena felt Damien's hand find hers briefly, a small, private gesture of reassurance, hidden from the watching eyes around them. Whatever fear still lingered in her heart, she found herself steadied by his quiet presence beside her, and she understood, in that moment, that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together. The formal claiming ritual could not be completed that same day. Tradition demanded a period of 3 days between the initial announcement and the ceremony itself. Time meant, according to the old texts, to allow the pack to prepare properly for witnessing such a significant bond, and time that Rurik intended to use fully to search for any weakness he could find in Damien's claim. Elena spent those 3 days in a state of constant tension, moved from the shared room she had occupied with the other kitchen staff into private quarters, near Damien's own chambers, a change that drew even more attention and speculation throughout the household. Marta visited her often during this time, though even her steady presence could not fully calm the anxiety that had settled deep in Elena's chest. "What if they find a way to challenge it?" Elena asked her friend one evening, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, in a room far grander than anything she had ever occupied before. "What if Rurik discovers some flaw in the claim that allows him to reject it?" Marta took her hands firmly. "Damien is Alpha King," she said. "He would not have made this claim before the entire council if he did not believe it would hold. Trust him, Elena. He has done nothing but protect you since the moment he learned your secret." Elena wanted desperately to believe her friend's confidence, but doubt continued to gnaw at her regardless. She had grown to trust Damien deeply in the weeks since their first conversation in the garden, had even begun to recognize something warmer than simple gratitude blooming quietly in her heart whenever she thought of him. But trust in Damien himself did little to ease her fear of Rurik, of the council, of the ancient traditions that had governed her people for so many generations, and had rarely shown mercy toward women in her position. Damien, meanwhile, spent those same 3 days locked in careful preparation, meeting privately with the few council members he believed might be persuaded to support his claim, rather than side automatically with Rurik's more traditional interpretation of pack law. He found some allies, older wolves, who had quietly disagreed with the harshness of the purity trial for years, but had never possessed the standing or the courage to challenge it openly. He found others less receptive, wolves who valued tradition above all else, and viewed any deviation from established law as a threat to the very foundation of pack society. Rurik, for his part, used the 3 days to search through every historical record he could access, searching for any precedent that might invalidate a claim made under circumstances such as these. He found nothing that explicitly forbade an alpha from claiming a mate already carrying a child conceived before the bond, though he continued to argue, in quiet conversations with his allies, that the timing and circumstances of this particular claim reeked of political convenience rather than genuine devotion. "He is protecting a servant from punishment she rightfully deserves under our laws," Rurik told his closest allies during one such private meeting. "Whether or not he truly cares for her is almost beside the point. He is using his authority to circumvent traditions that exist for good reason, and if we allow this to stand unchallenged, what precedent does it set for the future? Any wolf who breaks our laws need only convince the Alpha King to claim them as a mate, and suddenly all consequences simply disappear." His allies listened with varying degrees of agreement, some persuaded fully by his argument, others more cautious, understanding the delicate political position they occupied, should they choose to openly challenge an alpha king, who commanded significant respect and loyalty throughout the territory, despite Rurik's concerns. On the evening before the claiming ceremony was set to take place, Damien sought Elena out in her new quarters, finding her standing near the window, staring out at the darkening sky with an expression of quiet contemplation. "You seem troubled," he said softly, closing the door behind him. Elena turned to face him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had brought them to this point settling comfortably into the quiet space between them. "I keep thinking about tomorrow," she admitted finally. "About what it will mean, not just for my safety, but for us, for whatever this has become between us these past weeks." Damien crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes clearly in the dim evening light. "Tell me what you fear," he said gently. "I fear that this bond began as an arrangement of convenience and protection," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I fear that somewhere along the way, at least for me, it has become something more than that. I do not know how to ask whether you feel the same, without risking everything we have built together, if the answer is not what I hope to hear." Damien reached out, taking her hand gently in his own, a small gesture that nonetheless carried enormous weight, given everything unspoken between them until this moment. "Elena," he said softly, "when I first heard your voice through that door months ago, I told myself I was simply doing what any responsible leader should do, protecting someone under my care from an unjust fate. But somewhere in the weeks since then, watching your strength, your courage, the gentle way you carry yourself even under the weight of such fear, I have come to care for you in ways I did not expect and did not plan for. Tomorrow's ceremony began as a matter of protection and law. For me, it has become something I hope for far more personally than that." Elena felt tears gather in her eyes, though this time they carried none of the fear and desperation that had defined so much of the past months. Relief, and something warmer, something she had not allowed herself to fully name until this moment, filled her chest instead. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I did not expect to find this, not here, not now, not after everything I ran from months ago. But I am grateful, Damien, more grateful than I know how to express, that it was your voice I heard offering me protection, and your patience that allowed me to trust it." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the uncertainty of tomorrow's ceremony still looming ahead of them, but somehow feeling less frightening, now that they faced it together, with honesty finally spoken openly between them. Whatever challenges Rurik and the council might still bring, Elena found herself facing the coming day with a steadiness she had not expected to feel, grounded in the quiet certainty that whatever happened, she would not be facing it alone. "Rest tonight if you can," Damien said finally, though he seemed reluctant to leave her. "Tomorrow will demand everything from both of us." Elena nodded, though sleep, she suspected, would remain elusive for most of the night ahead. As Damien moved toward the door, she called his name softly, and when he turned back to look at her, she offered him a small, genuine smile, the first she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Damien returned her smile, a rare softness crossing his usually composed features. "Tomorrow, we face this together," he said. "And whatever the council decides, Elena, know that my claim on you was never simply about protecting you from punishment. It was, and remains, about wanting you beside me, for as long as you will have me." He left her alone with those words hanging warmly in the quiet room, and though the ceremony ahead still carried enormous uncertainty and risk, Elena found herself, for the first time in many months, facing the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. The great hall had been transformed by morning, benches arranged in careful rows to accommodate the entire pack, who had gathered in numbers Elena had never seen before, drawn by curiosity and the significance of witnessing their Alpha King's formal claiming ceremony. She stood in a small antechamber just off the main hall, dressed in a simple gown of pale blue that Marta had helped her prepare the night before, her hands trembling despite every effort to steady them. "You look beautiful," Marta told her, adjusting a small detail of her dress with careful, affectionate hands. "And you look ready, Elena, whatever your nerves might be telling you." Elena managed a small, grateful smile, though her heart continued to race as the sound of the gathering crowd filtered through the walls of the antechamber. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she admitted quietly. It feels too fragile to trust, after everything. Nothing has to be fragile that is built on truth, Marta said firmly. And what you and Damien have built these past weeks, whatever it began as, has become truth. Trust that, Elena. Trust him. The doors to the antechamber opened before Elena could respond further, and a young attendant informed her that the council was ready to begin. She took a deep, steadying breath, offered Marta one final grateful glance, and walked through the doors into the great hall, where hundreds of eyes turned to watch her approach. Damien stood waiting near the center of the hall, dressed formally in the deep colors traditionally worn by an Alpha King during significant ceremonies, his expression calm and confident, despite the weight of everything riding on the events about to unfold. When his eyes met Elena's across the crowded hall, something softened in his features, a private warmth meant only for her amid the formal solemnity of the occasion. She walked toward him slowly, acutely aware of every eye following her progress, of the whispered speculation rippling through the crowd, of Rurik and the other elders watching from their positions near the front of the hall with expressions ranging from cautious neutrality to unmistakable disapproval. When she reached him, Damien took her hands in his, turning to face the assembled council and pack members together, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hall. "Members of this council, and all who have gathered here today," he began, "I stand before you to formally claim Elena as my chosen mate, under the full authority granted to me as Alpha King of this territory. I claim her not out of obligation or convenience, but out of genuine devotion, and I claim the child she carries as my own, to be raised and protected within this pack, with every right and privilege afforded to any child born of a recognized bond." A murmur swept through the gathered crowd, though it carried more curiosity than open hostility, the pack members present seeming genuinely moved by the sincerity in their Alpha King's voice. Rurik, however, stepped forward from his position among the elders, his expression grave and unyielding. "Before this claim can be formally recognized," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs with practiced authority, "tradition demands that both parties demonstrate the sincerity of their bond before the full council. I request that the Alpha King and his intended mate answer questions regarding the nature and history of their relationship, to ensure this claim meets every requirement our laws demand." Damien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he inclined his head in agreement, understanding that refusing such a request would only feed further suspicion. "Ask what you must, councilman," he said evenly. Rurik's questions came sharp and probing, testing the depth and history of their supposed bond, questioning the timing of the announcement, questioning why no one within the household had witnessed any courtship between them before recent weeks. Damien answered each question with careful honesty, describing, in general terms that protected the more sensitive details of how their connection had truly begun, the growing bond that had developed between them since he first took notice of her within his household. Elena, when questioned directly, found her voice steadier than she had expected, speaking with quiet conviction about the genuine care and protection Damien had shown her, about the trust that had grown between them despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Her sincerity, evident in every word and every careful glance she exchanged with Damien throughout the questioning, seemed to sway even some of the more skeptical members of the gathered crowd. Rurik, sensing the shifting mood of the hall, pressed harder, his questions growing increasingly pointed. "And what of the child's true parentage?" he asked finally, his eyes narrowing as he studied Elena's reaction carefully. "Can either of you confirm, before this entire council, that the child she carries was conceived within the bond you claim to share?" The hall fell into tense silence, every eye turning toward Damien and Elena, waiting for an answer that would determine everything. Elena felt her heart pounding painfully in her chest, understanding that this question struck directly at the heart of the deception Rurik had suspected from the very beginning. Damien stepped forward, before Elena could answer, his voice calm and unwavering, despite the weight of the question hanging over the hall. "The child Elena carries is, and will be recognized as, my own," he said firmly. "Under the full authority of the claiming law you yourself cited, Councilman Rurik, any child carried by a claimed mate, at the time of the bonding ceremony, is recognized as legitimate, regardless of the circumstances of conception before that bond was formed. This is not a loophole I have invented. It is written clearly within our own founding texts, texts I know you have studied as thoroughly as I have these past days." Rurik's expression tightened, caught between his determination to challenge the claim and the undeniable accuracy of Damien's citation of pack law. He glanced toward the other elders gathered near him, searching for support, but found several of them nodding slowly, acknowledging the validity of what Damien had just stated. "The law is clear on this point, my lord," one of the older elders finally said, breaking the tense silence. "If the Alpha King claims her formally, before this council, the child is recognized as legitimate under the bond, regardless of the timing of conception. This has always been the law, even if it has rarely been invoked in the manner we witness today." Rurik's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, his careful case beginning to crumble under the weight of the very traditions he had sworn to protect. He studied Damien for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, resignation, mixed with grudging, reluctant respect for a young alpha, who had clearly done his research far more thoroughly than Rurik had anticipated. "Very well," Rurik said finally, his voice quieter than before. "If this council finds no legal grounds to reject the claim, then I will not stand in the way of proper procedure. But let it be known, my lord, that I still question the circumstances that brought us to this point, even as I acknowledge the legal validity of your actions today." Damien inclined his head respectfully toward the old elder. "Your caution has always served this pack well, councilman," he said. "I do not fault you for demanding thorough scrutiny of a claim as significant as this one. I only hope that in time, you will come to see this bond as I do, genuine and lasting, rather than merely a convenient escape from punishment." The council deliberated briefly among themselves before rendering their formal verdict, and when the eldest among them finally rose to announce their decision, the great hall fell into anticipatory silence once more. "This council recognizes the claim of Alpha King Damien Blackthorn upon Elena as his chosen mate," the elder declared, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "The child she carries is hereby recognized as legitimate, under the full protection of pack law. Let this ceremony proceed as tradition demands, and let this pack witness the bonding of its Alpha King, before the eyes of all present." The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and murmured conversation as the formal ceremony began to unfold, Damien and Elena standing together at its center, hands clasped tightly, having weathered the most dangerous test their bond would yet face. Elena felt tears of relief gathering in her eyes as the ceremony proceeded, the weight of months of fear finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. But even as celebration filled the hall around them, Elena caught sight of Rurik standing near the edge of the crowd, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes carrying a watchfulness that suggested this was far from the end of his scrutiny. Whatever peace this ceremony had won them today, she understood, with a small shiver of lingering unease, that the old elder's suspicion had not been fully extinguished, only delayed. The weeks following the ceremony brought a strange new rhythm to Elena's life, one she was still learning to navigate with each passing day. She was no longer a kitchen servant hiding a dangerous secret, but the formally recognized mate of the Alpha King himself, a position that came with privileges she had never imagined for herself, alongside expectations and scrutiny that felt, at times, just as overwhelming as the fear she had lived under before. The household staff who had once barely noticed her, now treated her with careful deference, though Elena could sense, beneath the polite formality, a lingering uncertainty about how to regard a woman who had risen so suddenly and unexpectedly from their own ranks to stand beside their Alpha King. Marta remained her closest confidant throughout this transition, one of the few people who continued to treat her exactly as she always had, a friendship Elena treasured more than ever amid the strange new world she now inhabited. Rurik, true to Elena's earlier unease, did not simply accept the council's ruling and move on. He remained watchful, courteous in public but clearly still searching for any opportunity to challenge what he continued to view, privately, as a dangerous precedent for the future of pack law. He found his opportunity sooner than anyone expected, though not in the way he had originally anticipated. It began with a traveling merchant who arrived at the territory's borders roughly a month after the ceremony, seeking trade agreements with the Blackthorn pack. Among his goods and his news from distant territories, he carried a piece of information that would soon upend everything Elena believed she understood about the night that had changed her life months earlier. The merchant spoke, during a casual conversation with members of Damien's household, of unrest within a distant rival pack, one that had recently lost a promising young warrior under mysterious circumstances involving accusations of betrayal against his own leadership. The warrior, the merchant explained, had been exiled months earlier after refusing to participate in a planned attack against a neighboring territory, an attack he considered dishonorable, given the terms of an existing peace agreement. The description of this exiled warrior, when it eventually reached Elena through the careful gossip that traveled through any large household, struck her with sudden, unexpected recognition. The timing matched. The description of his appearance matched. Even the general location where he had reportedly been last seen, wandering without a pack or protection, matched the area where she had encountered the stranger who had shown her kindness during her darkest night of fear and exhaustion. She brought this information to Damien immediately, her mind racing with questions she had never expected to have answered. "Do you think it could truly be him?" she asked, sitting across from Damien in his study as she recounted everything she had learned. Damien considered the information carefully, his expression thoughtful. "It is possible," he said slowly. "If this warrior was exiled for refusing to participate in dishonorable actions against a neighboring pack, it would explain why he was alone and vulnerable enough to have wandered into the very territory where you found him that night." Elena felt a complicated tangle of emotions rising within her at this possibility. Gratitude toward a stranger who had shown her kindness during her most desperate hour. Curiosity about a man whose face she barely remembered clearly, and beneath all of that, a quiet worry about what this discovery might mean for the life she had begun building with Damien. "What happens if he is found?" she asked quietly. "What happens if he learns of the child?" Damien was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the same question himself. "That is a possibility we will need to prepare for," he said finally. "But Elena, I need you to know that whatever we learn about this man, whatever role he may have played in your past, it changes nothing about my commitment to you and to the child we are raising together. The claim I made before the council was not conditional, it was absolute." Elena reached across the space between them, taking his hand in her own, grateful beyond words for the steadiness of his reassurance amid this unexpected complication. "I know," she said softly. "I only worry about what further scrutiny this might bring, especially from Rurik." Her worry proved well-founded. Word of the exiled warrior's possible connection to Elena's child spread quickly through the household, eventually reaching Rurik through the same channels of gossip that had first brought the information to Elena's attention. The old elder seized upon this new information eagerly, seeing in it a fresh opportunity to challenge the legitimacy of Damien's claim, arguing before the council that if the child's true father could be identified and located, questions would inevitably arise about whether the original claiming ceremony had been conducted with full and honest disclosure of all relevant circumstances. Damien called for another council session before Rurik could gather enough support to force the issue himself, understanding that facing this challenge directly and honestly would serve his position far better than allowing rumor and speculation to fester unaddressed. "I will not pretend that circumstances have not changed since our original claiming ceremony," Damien told the assembled council, standing once again at the center of the great hall with Elena beside him, her hand held firmly in his own. "New information has come to light regarding the possible identity of the child's biological father, a warrior exiled from a neighboring pack for refusing to participate in dishonorable actions against innocent people. I share this information openly with this council, not because our laws require it, but because I believe in facing challenges with complete honesty, rather than allowing suspicion and rumor to undermine the trust this pack has placed in its leadership." Rurik studied him carefully throughout this declaration, clearly searching for any weakness he could exploit, but finding instead only the same steady confidence Damien had displayed throughout every previous challenge to their bond. "And what do you propose we do with this information?" Rurik asked finally. "Nothing changes," Damien said firmly. "The claim I made before this council remains absolute and unconditional. Elena is my mate. The child she carries is my own, recognized fully under our laws, regardless of the biological circumstances of conception. If this exiled warrior is ever found and wishes to know of the child's well-being, I have no objection to allowing such contact, provided it poses no danger to my family. But it will not change the child's place within this pack, nor Elena's place beside me." The council deliberated briefly, though this time the discussion carried far less tension than their previous session, many of the elders having already witnessed enough of Damien and Elena's genuine devotion over the preceding weeks to feel confident in the sincerity of their bond. When the eldest elder finally spoke, confirming that nothing about this new information altered the council's previous ruling, Rurik offered no further objection, though his expression remained thoughtful and unconvinced in ways that suggested his scrutiny, even now, had not fully faded. That evening, alone together in their private quarters, Elena found herself unexpectedly emotional over everything the day had brought. "It feels strange," she admitted to Damien, "to learn that the man who showed me kindness during my darkest hour was fighting his own battle against dishonor and cruelty, without either of us ever knowing the other's true circumstances." Damien pulled her gently into his arms, offering comfort without words for a long moment before speaking again. "Perhaps someday, if he is found and wishes it, our child will have the chance to know something of that story," he said softly. "But whatever happens, Elena, know that this family we are building, the one growing here between us, was never dependent on circumstances beyond our control. It was built on choice, on trust, on the willingness we both showed to protect what mattered most, regardless of the obstacles standing in our way." Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, grateful beyond measure for the man who had heard her desperate plea through a closed door months ago, and had chosen, again and again since that moment, to stand beside her rather than turn away. The final weeks of Elena's pregnancy passed, with a peace she had never dared to hope for during those first terrified months of hiding and fear. Rurik, though never fully abandoning his cautious watchfulness, had gradually softened in his treatment of both Elena and Damien, worn down not by argument or legal precedent, but by the simple, undeniable evidence of genuine devotion he witnessed between them with each passing week. He remained a strict guardian of tradition, but even he could not deny the sincerity that had grown between his Alpha King and the woman who now stood confidently beside him as a recognized and respected member of the pack. Elena found herself, in these final weeks, embracing a role she had never expected to hold, moving through the great house, not as a frightened servant hiding her secret in shadowed corners, but as the confident, capable mate of the territory's Alpha King, greeted with genuine warmth by staff and pack members alike who had come to admire the quiet strength she had shown throughout everything the past months had demanded of her. Marta remained close throughout this transformation, her friendship unwavering despite the enormous changes in Elena's circumstances. "You have come so far," Marta told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the garden where Elena's story with Damien had truly begun months earlier. "I remember how frightened you were, that very first night you told me your secret. I could never have imagined it would lead you here." "Neither could I," Elena admitted, smiling as she rested a gentle hand against the full curve of her stomach. "But I am grateful, every single day, that fear did not win in the end." The child arrived on a quiet evening in early autumn, the leaves outside just beginning to turn gold and amber against a clear sky. Elena's labor was long, but without serious complication, attended by the most skilled healers within the territory, with Damien remaining steadily by her side throughout every difficult hour, offering quiet strength and comfort in whatever way she needed. When the healers finally placed the newborn in Elena's arms, a healthy baby girl with a strong cry and clear, curious eyes, Elena felt every fear and hardship of the past months dissolve entirely beneath an overwhelming wave of love unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Damien knelt beside the bed, watching his mate cradle their daughter with an expression of such profound tenderness that Elena felt her heart nearly overflow at the sight of it. "She is perfect," Damien said softly, reaching out to gently touch the baby's small hand, marveling at how such tiny fingers could wrap so firmly around his own. Elena looked up at him, tears of exhaustion and joy mingling freely on her cheeks. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Word of the child's safe arrival spread quickly through the household and beyond, into the wider territory that had watched, with growing interest and affection, the unlikely story of their Alpha King and the humble kitchen servant he had claimed as his mate against the weight of ancient tradition. Well wishes poured in from across the pack, and even Rurik, upon visiting to formally acknowledge the newest member of the Blackthorn lineage, found himself unexpectedly moved by the sight of the tiny, healthy infant, his customary sternness softening for just a moment, as he offered his own quiet blessing. "She will grow up strong, given the strength her mother has already shown," Rurik said, studying the sleeping infant with an expression Elena had never seen from him before. I confess, my lord, that I doubted the wisdom of your choices these past months. I do not doubt them any longer." Damien accepted the old elder's words with quiet grace, understanding that this small acknowledgement, coming from a wolf as stubborn and traditional as Rurik, represented a significant shift in how their bond, and the precedent it had set, would be remembered within the pack's history going forward. In the weeks that followed the child's birth, whom they named Wren, after the small, resilient birds that nested each spring in the garden where Elena and Damien's story had truly begun, life within the great house settled into a warmth and stability that Elena had once believed impossible for someone in her circumstances to ever achieve. She watched Damien with their daughter each evening, marveling at the gentleness this powerful, formidable alpha king showed toward the tiny life they had fought so hard to protect, and she found herself grateful, in ways too deep for words, for every difficult step of the journey that had led them to this quiet, peaceful moment. She thought sometimes of the stranger who had shown her kindness that desperate night months ago, wondering if he had found safety somewhere, wondering if he would ever learn of the daughter he had unknowingly helped bring into the world. Damien had quietly sent word through trusted contacts to the neighboring territories, offering safe passage and welcome should the exiled warrior ever wish to know of the child's well-being, though no response had yet come. Elena hoped, whenever her thoughts drifted to him, that wherever he was, he had found some measure of the peace and safety she herself had been so fortunate to find. One evening, as autumn deepened further and the first hints of winter chill began creeping into the evening air, Elena stood with Damien in the same garden where he had first invited her to speak openly with him, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. The old stone fountain still stood at the garden's center, unchanged, despite everything that had transpired around it in the months since. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Elena asked quietly, watching the last light of sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. "If you had simply walked past that door without stopping to listen." Damien wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, drawing her close against his side. "Every day," he admitted softly. "And every day, I am grateful beyond words that something made me stop." Elena leaned into him, their daughter stirring slightly in her arms, before settling back into peaceful sleep, and she felt, in that quiet moment, a sense of belonging and safety she had once believed she would never know again, after fleeing everything familiar to her months earlier. The fear that had once defined her days had been replaced entirely by something far stronger, a family built not on obligation or ancient tradition, but on genuine choice, courage, and love that had grown steadily stronger through every challenge they had faced together. No law in this territory would ever again threaten what they had built. Damien had made certain of that, working steadily in the months that followed to reform the harsh traditions that had once nearly cost Elena everything, ensuring that no other young mother would ever again have to hide in fear behind a closed door, praying desperately that no one would take her child away. As darkness settled fully over the garden, and the first stars began appearing in the clear evening sky above, Elena rested her head against Damien's shoulder, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, and allowed herself, at last, to simply feel the quiet, hard-won peace of a family finally safe, finally whole, and finally free from the fear that had once threatened to take everything away.